Okay, let's dive right in. Today we're looking at a pretty intense report. Global Everything Collapse, Part 1 from the Great Awakening report.
That's right. And it really tries to connect a lot of dots, suggesting that the global pressures we're seeing aren't isolated.
Yeah, it's not just saying, oh, the economy's down or politics are messy. It's arguing there's, well, a deliberate design behind it all.
Exactly. A deliberate destabilization, orchestrated, they claim, by certain interconnected elites. Think international banking, government links, resource control.
It's ambitious in scope. They're talking about deep corruption, even mentioning things like human trafficking and systemic exploitation as part of this larger picture.
And the report suggests this isn't new. It frames it as a decades-long plan by, financial elites, big corporations, intelligence agencies, even shadow governments.
Wow, decades. With goals like, what, economic enslavement and information control?
Pretty much. Economic control, suppressing information, achieving dominance. That's the core claim presented in the report.
It sounds huge, almost overwhelming, really. And the report itself kind of admits that, right? That there's a lot of noise, propaganda, misinformation out there.
It does. It stresses trying to see the connections, the layers beneath the surface noise.
So our goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is to unpack these initial claims from Part 1. We'll focus especially on what the report says about global industries, markets, and see how it might, connect to what's happening right now.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Let's start with their first big point, the engineered collapse of global commerce. They seem to challenge the whole idea of free markets.
They really do. The report argues that global industries and financial markets haven't been truly free for a while. They see them as manipulated systems.
Manipulated how? To what end?
Primarily to concentrate wealth and power. The report points to a few key mechanisms they believe are used.
Okay, like what?
Things like market centralization. You see fewer, bigger companies dominating, right? Also, regulatory capture, where the rules end up favoring those big players.
I think people see that consolidation happening.
Yeah, and then there are corporate subsidies, bailouts, help for the big guys that smaller ones don't get, and crucially, debt-driven economic growth.
Debt-driven growth, creating dependency.
That's the idea presented, a cycle of dependence on these financial systems. It definitely makes you look differently at industry consolidation and debates about corporate influence.
Absolutely. Okay, moving on to Wall Street. The report titles this section, Wall Street and Financial Markets, a Controlled Demolition. That's quite a phrase.
It is strong wording, yeah. Their core argument is that financial markets aren't organic anymore, not just supply and demand.
So what are they then, according to the report?
Manipulated. They point to things like high-frequency algorithmic trading, insider information, and especially central bank interventions.
Central banks, like the Fed, how do they fit in?
Well, the report mentions specific tactics, things like stock market inflation through quantitative easing, basically pumping money in.
Which some might say artificially props up prices.
That's the report's perspective, yes. They also talk about derivative manipulation, those complex financial instruments, and loan and mortgage bubbles creating instability.
Like the 2008 crisis, maybe?
They'd likely frame that within this context, yes. And even using markets for economic warfare. You can see how this view connects to current worries about inflation, market volatility. It offers a different lens.
It really does. Okay, this next one sounds pretty radical. The illusion of sovereign government, U.S. corporation bankruptcy. What on earth are they claiming here?
Okay, so this is a controversial point in the report. They argue the U.S. government doesn't operate as a truly sovereign nation representing its people, but more like, a corporate entity.
A corporation. Serving whom?
Global financial interests, according to the report. They often point to the Act of 1871 as a sort of foundational moment for this shift.
The Act of 1871. And how does the Federal Reserve tie into this corporate idea?
The report positions the Fed as absolutely central to enabling this, through managing fiat currency money not backed by gold, and creating national debt.
So the Fed isn't seen as a neutral entity.
Not in this report's view. It's seen as the mechanism that allows this corporate government to function and serve those financial interests, perpetuating debt. It certainly ties into real-world debates about national debt and the Fed's role.
Which leads right into their next section, monetary system and Federal Reserve banks. The debt trap. Seems they have more to say about central banks.
Oh, definitely. The report essentially views the Fed and other central banks globally as a kind of financial cartel.
A cartel. That's strong.
Yeah. manipulating economies, they argue, through controlling inflation, setting interest rates, and fundamentally through creating debt.
And they're critical of fiat currency itself.
Very critical. The argument is that because it's not backed by anything tangible, it inherently loses value over time. That's inflation eroding your purchasing power.
So where do they see this heading? They must talk about digital currencies.
They do. Central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. The report expresses significant concern here.
Concern how? Lots of countries are exploring them.
The report frames it as a potential tool for much greater government control over your money. Less privacy, more tracking, maybe even linking spending to, well, compliance.
Linking spending to compliance.
Yeah.
Like a social credit system.
That's the kind of potential future the report warns about with CBDCs. It's definitely part of the current global discussion on digital money's future.
Okay, let's pivot slightly. Product and service industries and markets, supply chain unraveling, and digital rationing. This hits home after the last few years.
Absolutely. We've all felt those supply chain problems, seen the empty shelves, dealt with delays and tariffs impacting costs.
So does the report just blame the pandemic or ships stuck in canals?
No, it goes further. It suggests the unraveling of these supply chains might be intentional, part of a deliberate push.
Intentional? To what end?
Towards a new kind of economy, one that's more digital, controlled by AI, potentially using those CBDCs we just discussed.
So break down the supply chain to build up something else.
That's the theory presented. A future where AI manages commerce. Maybe your ability to buy things is tied to a digital ID or social score.
Wow. And they mention rationing, digital rationing.
Yeah, the idea being that in such a system, access to goods might be controlled or allocated digitally. They even suggest it could lead to the end of private ownership as we know it, with corporations controlling distribution.
That's a very different vision of the future. And what about the little guy in all this? Small businesses.
Right, the report has a section, Small Business Owners and Entrepreneurs. An intentional struggle.
Which feels very real for many right now. Inflation, regulations, supply issues.
Exactly. The report argues these aren't just unfortunate market forces. It claims small businesses are being systematically squeezed.
Systematically? How?
Through all those pressures you mentioned, inflation, complex regulations, those persistent supply chain problems, plus competing against giant corporations that maybe get preferential treatment or bailouts.
Yeah.
Tariffs also disproportionately hit smaller players sometimes.
And the alleged goal of this squeeze?
To eliminate competition, essentially. To crush independent businesses and force everyone towards reliance on a few mega corporations.
Making people more dependent on the big players.
That's the perspective laid out in the report. It connects the struggles we see small businesses facing directly to this larger alleged agenda.
Okay, so let's try and connect the dots here, as the report seems to want us to do. You've got volatile financial markets, questions about government structure, a critical view of the monetary system and the Fed, deliberately disrupted supply chains, and struggling small businesses.
Exactly. The report's core message is that these aren't separate crises happening randomly. They are presented as interconnected parts of a single, intentionally engineered collapse or transformation.
A transformation orchestrated by a network of powerful global players to consolidate control.
That is the central narrative presented in Global Everything Collapse, Part 1. It argues these pressures are working together towards that end.
So we've walked through the main claims of this first part of the report from the Great Awakening report. It paints a picture, a very specific picture, of deliberate, interconnected global challenges.
It certainly does. It reframes things like market instability, supply issues, even the struggles of small businesses as potential pieces of a larger planned agenda.
And the report essentially leaves you, the listener, with a choice, doesn't it? Or at least a question.
Right. Faced with this analysis, this idea of an engineered shift, the implicit question is, what's the response? Do you accept it? Dig deeper? Maybe look towards building more resilient, independent systems?
A challenging thought to end on, and remember, this was just part 1. The report apparently goes on to cover energy, healthcare, technology, and more. Lots to potentially unpack down the line.
Definitely a lot more ground the full report seems to cover.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive today. It's certainly given us, and hopefully